So, Arcade Paradise was a good idea that could have had better execution. I think the idea of being an arcade owner in the 90s and you run the business and can also play the games, I think there's a lot of potential with that whole concept. But part of my problem with the game is one, the laundromat aspect that gets tedious real quick. It's kind of a huge hurdle to overcome because once you're just dealing with the arcade, the game becomes infinitely better. But there is the issue that you're never playing arcade games that you remember. You're playing games that are sort of bootlegs. They're a lot like games you remember, but not quite. And it's also a little strange that this is supposed to be an arcade in the 90s, but there are no fighting games of any kind. And as someone who lived through 90s arcades, most arcades had a whole bunch of different fighting games. Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat kind of kicked off that trend, but seriously, there were tons of fighters in the 90s, both good and bad. And because they were so popular, it didn't matter if they were good or bad, there were people playing them. And it just seems odd that those games are completely unrepresented here. It's also a little strange that there's a Dance Dance Revolution type game, as Dance Dance Revolution didn't come out in the States until March of '99. And sure, that's technically the 90s, but a lot of what you see in this game implies that it's the early to mid-90s. But in fairness, the year is never directly stated, so far as I can tell. And it's also kind of odd that puzzle games seem to be overrepresented for a 90s arcade. And sure, trends in arcade games changed with the years. Before fighting games became so big, it was actually beat-em-ups that were everywhere in arcades. And strangely, there's only one beat-em-up game you can get in Arcade Paradise. There's also no light guns anywhere. Those were a pretty big staple. And it just seems odd to me that they want to make a game about running a 90s arcade, and then kind of go out of their way to not make it feel like a 90s arcade. Personally, I think this might have worked better had they set it in the 80s. A lot of the games that are on offer feel more like 80s arcade games, and certainly you would still find those in the 90s, but oftentimes when you found arcade machines of that vintage in the 90s, they had been repaired a few times, they had a lot of unofficial parts on them. It looked as if someone who wasn't really an expert had done their best to make them function again. But every arcade game here looks like a fresh, pristine arcade game, and I never saw an arcade that had a lot of cabinets that were fresh and pristine. Even if you saw one that had just been put in that day, usually by the end of that day, it had taken a few dings. And I get it, realism might not have been the primary goal when making Arcade Paradise, but I'm not really sure what the primary goal was, because really, there's not a way to lose money at your business, so far as I can tell. So you can't help but succeed as long as you just keep grinding away. So I'm guessing the point was to have the arcade games here, but I would have been more interested had they been real, actual old arcade games. Please do subscribe, comment, like, and tell your friends.